Why does the President of the United States give a State of the Union address?
The U.S. Constitution requires the President to annually present a joint session of Congress, attended by representatives and senators, with a status report on the nation. Presidents George Washington, 1732–1799, and John Adams, 1735–1826. The first and second presidents delivered their messages in person. Thereafter the State of the Union was sent as a written message, which was read in Congress. But President Woodrow Wilson, 1856–1924, delivered his messages in person, including that of January 1918, when he delivered the 14 points his formulation of a peace program for Europe once World War I. 1914–18, had ended. Since Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882–1945, held office, beginning in 1933, all U.S. presidents have made formal addresses to Congress.
How were Theodore and Franklin Roosevelt related?
The two men, among America's most well-known presidents, were distant cousins. Theodore Roosevelt, 1858–1919, was born in New York City, and after a career in public service that included organizing the first volunteer cavalry regiment that was known as the Rough Riders. The ardent outdoors enthusiast became vice president in 1901, when President William McKinley, 1843–1901, died in office later that year. On September 14, Teddy Roosevelt succeeded him as president. He was elected in his own right in 1904 and went on to serve until 1909. Spending nearly 2 full terms in the White House. Teddy Roosevelt was President of the United States when he walked his niece, Eleanor Roosevelt, 1884–1962, down the aisle on March 17, 1905. The young woman was marrying her distant cousin Franklin Delano Roosevelt, 1882–1945, who had been courting her since he entered college at Harvard in 1900. Franklin D. Roosevelt was born in Hyde Park, New York. Like his fifth cousin Theodore, Franklin went on to a life of public service, which bore some remarkable similarities to that of his cousin. Both Theodore and Franklin served as Assistant Secretary of the U.S. Navy, 1897–98 and 1913–20, respectively. And both were governors of New York, 1899–1900 and 1929–1933, respectively. As presidents, both served the nation for more than one term, but Franklin Roosevelt made history for being the only president to be elected for third and fourth terms. In 1951, the U.S. Congress voted in favor of the 22nd Amendment, limiting presidential tenure to just 2 terms. Both served the country in times of conflict. For Theodore it was the Russo-Japanese War, 1904–05, which he was instrumental in ending with the Treaty of Portsmouth, New Hampshire. on September 5, 1905, and for which he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize the following year. Franklin Roosevelt was one of the so-called Big Three leaders, along with Britain's Sir Winston Churchill. 1874 to 1965, and the Soviet Union's Joseph Stalin, 1879 to 1953. He coordinated the Allied nations' effort against Nazi Germany and Japan during World War II, 1939 to 45. He, too, was a champion of peace, having been central in laying plans for the United Nations. It's an interesting note, however, that when Teddy Roosevelt ran for president in 1912, he was opposed by his young Democratic cousin Franklin, then a state senator in New York, who supported Woodrow Wilson, 1856 to 1924, in the presidential race. After Wilson was elected, he appointed Franklin Roosevelt Assistant Secretary of the Navy, a post that delighted him for combining his vocation, politics, with his avocation, ships, and one that certainly furthered his political career. By the end of World War I, 1914-18, Franklin Roosevelt was a well-known national figure. Theodore and Franklin also shared an interest in outdoor activities. But Franklin's participation in sports was curtailed when he was stricken with polio in August 1921. The 39-year-old Roosevelt was paralyzed for a time. And though he later regained movement and was able to walk with braces, he never fully recovered. Through fierce determination he continued his life of public service, becoming president in 1933. He saw the country through two of its most trying periods, the Great Depression, 1929-39, and World War II, 1939-45. He died suddenly of a brain hemorrhage in April 1945.
Were the anthrax attacks acts of terrorism?
Yes, as U.S. Attorney General John Ashcroft said. When people send anthrax through the mail to hurt people and invoke terror, it's a terrorist act. Investigators believed the attacks, which killed 5 people and sickened 17 others, were acts of domestic terrorism. But whoever was responsible for mailing anthrax spores in the fall of 2001 remained unknown in mid-2005. Some observers believed the attacks were carried out to expose the nation's vulnerability to bioterrorist attacks.
What were the Articles of Confederation?
This American document was the forerunner to the U.S. Constitution, 1788. Drafted by the Continental Congress at York, Pennsylvania. On November 15, 1777, the Articles of Confederation went into effect on March 1, 1781, when the last state, Maryland, ratified them. The Articles had shortcomings that were later corrected by the Constitution. They provided the states with more power than the central government, stipulating that Congress rely on the states both to collect taxes and to carry out the acts of Congress. It is largely thanks to Alexander Hamilton, 1755 to 1804, that the Articles were thrown out. Realizing they made for a weak national government, Hamilton led the charge to strengthen the central government even at the expense of the states. Eventually, he won the backing of George Washington, 1732 to 1799, James Madison, 1751 to 1836, John Jay, 1745 to 1829, and others, which led to the convening of the Philadelphia Constitutional Convention, where the ineffectual Articles of Confederation were thrown out and the Constitution was drafted. One lasting provision of the Articles of Confederation was the Ordinance of 1787, signed in an era of westward expansion. The ordinance set the guidelines for how a territory could become a state. A legislature would be elected as soon as the population had reached 5,000 voting citizens, which were men only. And the territory would be eligible for statehood once its population had reached 60,000.
Why was Eleanor Roosevelt called the People's First Lady?
While several first ladies before her had also been active in the nation's life. Eleanor Roosevelt, 1884 to 1962, wife of 32nd President of the United States Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, stands out as one of the country's most active first ladies and as a woman of enormous accomplishment in her own right. During her husband's administration, which began in the dark days of the Great Depression, 1929 to 39, and continued as the world again went to war, Eleanor Roosevelt acted not only as an advisor to the president, but as the president's eyes and ears on the nation, traveling in a way that his physical condition prevented him from doing. From the start, Eleanor Roosevelt remained in constant communication with the American people. She was known for her weekly press conferences, numbering some 350 by the end of the Roosevelt presidency, that were open only to women reporters. In 1934 she began a radio program, which became so popular that she was soon dubbed the First Lady of Radio. Beginning in 1936 she authored a daily column called My Day, which was syndicated to newspapers around the country. These forums gave the First Lady an unprecedented voice in American life, and gave Americans a clear understanding of their First Lady and her concerns. Concerned about the effects of the Great Depression on American children, she was instrumental in creating the National Youth Administration, which helped high school and university students complete their studies before joining the workforce. She was a champion of minority groups, declaring that the right to work should know no color lines, and resigning from the Daughters of the American Revolution when the group refused to allow black singer Marian Anderson, 1897 to 1993, to perform at Constitution Hall. Eleanor Roosevelt was known for getting out among the people. She lectured frequently and made other public appearances in which she met and spoke face to face with the American people. A famous cartoon depicted a coal miner pausing in his work to exclaim, "For gosh sakes! Here comes Mrs. Roosevelt." During World War II, 1939–45, she made a remarkable 23,000-mile trip across the South Pacific, where she untiringly visited American GIs in field hospitals and on the lines. Mrs. Roosevelt was an advocate for the people, and it just so happened that she lived in the White House. A beloved First Lady who actively supported liberal causes and humanitarian concerns. She has been a model to subsequent First Ladies and women politicians and activists.
Who started the Boston Tea Party?
Many believe that on December 13, 1773, it was Patriot Samuel Adams, 1722–1803, who gave the signal to the men, who may have numbered more than 100 and were dressed as Indians, to board the ships in Boston Harbor and dump the tea overboard. Whether or not it was Adams who started the Tea Party, about this there can be no doubt. He was most certainly a leader in the agitation that led up to the event. The show of resistance was in response to the recent passage by the British Parliament of the Tea Act, which allowed the British-owned East India Company to dump tea on the American colonies at a low price and also required that the colonists pay a duty for said tea. Colonists feared the act would put local merchants out of business and that if they conceded to pay the duty to the British, they would soon be required to pay other taxes as well. Once the ships carrying the tea had arrived in Boston Harbor, the colonists tried to have them sent back to England. But when Governor Thomas Hutchinson, 1711–1780, of Massachusetts refused to order the return of the ships, Patriots organized their show of resistance, which came to be known as the Boston Tea Party.
Let operation in Afghanistan begin?
Joined principally by the United Kingdom, the U.S.-led military strikes on Afghanistan began on October 7, 2001 to 26 days after the terrorist attacks on the U.S. homeland. The goals were to weaken the Taliban government and root out terrorist cells in the Mideast nation. Al-Qaeda leader Osama bin Laden, 1957, the suspected 9/11 mastermind, was also a target. The strikes on Afghanistan, which the United States called Operation Enduring Freedom, OEF, were the first in the new war on terror. OEF's primary goal, ousting the ruling Taliban government, was achieved relatively quickly. By mid-November, the combined efforts of the U.S. military, British, and Afghanistan's Northern Alliance managed to take control of major cities, including the capital of Kabul. In late December, an interim government was established at an unconvened conference in Bonn, Germany. In June 2002, Hamid Karzai, 1957, was overwhelmingly elected as transitional president by the Loya Jirga. The traditional Afghan assembly of ethnic leaders, the transitional government was to run Afghanistan until national elections could be held in 2004. Despite strides in establishing the new government, fighting continued in the rugged mountainous terrain of eastern Afghanistan. Operation Anaconda was the name given to the U.S. military's effort to combat Taliban pockets of resistance, root out terrorist cells, and capture key al-Qaeda leaders, including Osama bin Laden, though he had reportedly fled to neighboring Pakistan. Violence also preceded the October 2004 election.
What were carpetbaggers?
Carpetbaggers was a derisive term that referred to northerners who arrived in the South in the early days of Reconstruction. 1865 to 77, the 12-year period of rebuilding that followed the American Civil War, 1861 to 65. Even though many of these northern businessmen intended to settle in the South, Southerners viewed them as outsiders and, worse, as opportunists who only intended to make a quick profit before returning north. They were called carpetbaggers because many carried carpetbags as luggage. Some Southerners even quipped that these Northerners could carry all their belongings in a carpetbag, implying that they were nothing more than transients. Nevertheless, Northerners who relocated to the South following the Civil War played an important role during Reconstruction. Some, aided by the black vote, gained public office and impacted state and local policy. But others proved to be corrupt. Because of the latter, the term carpetbagger became synonymous with a meddling, opportunistic outsider.
When did Operation Iraqi Freedom begin?
The U.S.-led multinational military campaign in Iraq began on March 19, 2003, with airstrikes on the capital of Baghdad. Ground forces moved into southern Iraq from neighboring Kuwait. After taking the southern city of Basra, U.S. Marines and Army infantry moved northward toward the capital. U.S. troops took control of Baghdad on April 9, after which images of gleeful Iraqis dismantling statues and other symbols of Saddam Hussein's despotic rule flooded the American media. Coalition forces, American troops, and U.S.-backed Kurdish fighters then pressed into northern Iraq, including Tikrit, Saddam's hometown, and a loyalist stronghold. On April 14, Tikrit fell. The war seemed to be near conclusion. But the hard combat had only begun and continued for years, even after the end of major combat was declared.
What were Napoleon's 100 Days?
The term refers to Napoleon Bonaparte's last 100 days as ruler of France. Having been defeated by his enemies, a coalition of European powers, Britain, Sweden, Austria, and Prussia, who aligned themselves against Napoleon's domination, the emperor abdicated the throne in the spring of 1814, and was exiled to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean Sea. There he heard of the confusion and discontent that came after he had descended the throne. He left Elba, and with more than 1,000 men, arrived on the French coast at Caen and marched inland to Paris. Hearing of his arrival, the new Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, 1755–1824, fled. On March 20 Napoleon began a new reign, but it was only to last until the European allies defeated him again. At the Battle of Waterloo, June 12–18. After that battle, the so-called Little Corporal, for his diminutive stature, was permanently exiled to the British island of St. Helena, where he remained until his death in 1821.
What are WMD?
WMD are weapons of mass destruction, nuclear, biological, or chemical weapons that can cause extensive casualties. The term emerged during World War II, 1939–45, the abbreviated WMD became part of everyday language in the late 1990s and early 2000s, as the world's superpowers and the United Nations turned their attention to serious threats posed by rogue states and terrorists in a post-Cold War society. Following the launch of the 2003 Iraq War, WMD were regularly in the news. The Bush administration and its chief ally, British Prime Minister Tony Blair, 1953, faced sharp public criticism when no weapons of mass destruction were found in Iraq. The presence of WMD in that rogue state had been the justification for the controversial invasion. In 2004, President Bush appointed a bipartisan commission to look into why U.S. intelligence agencies had concluded that Iraq possessed WMD. In late March 2005, the Commission released to the public an unclassified version of its report. The conclusion: intelligence errors had overstated Iraq's WMD programs. It stated, the daily intelligence briefings, before the Iraq War, were flawed. This was a major intelligence error. The Commission outlined 74 recommendations to improve intelligence gathering among the United States' 15 spy agencies. The classified version of the report contained information on the intelligence community's assessments of the nuclear programs of many of the world's most dangerous actors. It also provided more details on intelligence concerning the Al-Qaeda terrorist network. In Britain, the intelligence failures concerning Iraq spurred a years-long controversy, which damaged Blair's approval ratings and posed tragic consequences. In addition to the loss of life in Iraq, British weapons inspector David Kelly took his own life after publicly accusing the government of overstating the need for war. As in the United States, Britain took steps to tighten controls on its intelligence gathering to prevent errors in judgment. Despite the fact that no WMD were found in Iraq, the White House stood firm on the decision to invade Iraq. On September 11, 2004, the Office of the Press Secretary released a fact sheet titled 3 Years of Progress in the War on Terror. The document stated in part, "We were right to go into Iraq. We removed a declared enemy of America, who had defied the international community for 12 years. And who had the capability of producing weapons of mass murder. And could have passed that capability to the terrorists bent on acquiring them. Although we have not found stockpiles of weapons of mass destruction. In the world after September 11, that was a risk we could not afford to take."
What is the War on Terror?
In his remarks the evening of September 11, 2001, President George W. Bush, 1946, vowed that America and our friends and allies join with all those who want peace and security in the world. And we stand together to win the war against terrorism. TV newscasts were soon emblazoned with the message. America's War on Terror, or simply, the War on Terror. The events of 9/11 catapulted the free world into a new era, in which conflicts no longer were limited to wars between nations. There was a new enemy, which knew no national boundaries, whose army was covert, and which mercilessly targeted civilians. Acknowledging that the new threat could not be met by the United States alone, the Bush administration began forging an alliance of nations that together would use diplomacy, take military action, and coordinate intelligence and law enforcement efforts to combat terrorists around the globe. On September 12, 2001, Secretary of State Colin Powell, 1937, called for a global coalition against terrorism. Eventually the Bush administration put together an alliance of 84 countries, called the Global Coalition Against Terrorism, united against a common danger, and joined in a common purpose. The strike on Afghanistan, called Operation Enduring Freedom, was the first military strategy in the new war. The next major initiative was the war in Iraq. While those operations were underway, terrorist strikes continued around the globe. In March 2004, following the commuter train blasts in Spain, President Bush remarked that the murders in Madrid are a reminder that the civilized world is at war. And in this new kind of war, civilians find themselves suddenly on the front lines. In recent years, terrorists have struck from Spain, to Russia, to Israel, to East Africa, to Morocco, to the Philippines, and to the United States. They've targeted Arab states such as Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and Yemen. They've attacked Muslims in Indonesia, Turkey, Pakistan, Iraq, and Afghanistan. No nation or region is exempt from the terrorists' campaign of violence.
What was Teapot Dome?
Teapot Dome was a notorious political scandal that was on a level with Watergate, 1972. While the early 1920s abuses of power affected President Warren G. Harding, 1865 to 1923, it was not Harding who was implicated in the crimes. Albert Bacon Fall, 1861 to 1944, Harding's Secretary of the Interior. Secretly transferred government oil lands at Elk Hills, California, and Teapot Dome, Wyoming, to private use, and he did so without a formal bidding process. Fall leased the Elk Hills naval oil reserves to American businessman Edward L. Doheny, 1856 to 1935, in exchange for an interest-free loan of $100,000. Fall made a similar arrangement with another businessman, Harry F. Sinclair, 1876 to 1956, of Sinclair Oil Corporation, leasing the Teapot Dome reserves in exchange for $300,000 in cash, bonds, and livestock. The scandal was revealed in 1922. And committees of the U.S. Senate and a special commission spent the next 6 years sorting it all out. By the time the hearings and investigations were concluded in 1928, Harding had died. Fall had resigned from office and taken a job working for Sinclair, all three players Doheny, Sinclair, and Fall had faced charges, and the government had successfully sued the oil companies for the return of the lands. The punishments were light considering the serious nature of the charges. Fall was convicted of accepting a bribe, fined $100,000, and sentenced to a year in prison. While Doheny and Sinclair were both indicted but later acquitted of the charges against them, which included conspiracy and bribery.
Which U.S. president held the first press conference?
President Woodrow Wilson, 1856 to 1924. Was the first president to routinely assemble the press to answer questions for the public. On March 15, 1913, shortly after his inauguration, he called the first presidential press conference. More than 100 news reporters attended the event. Decades later, President John F. Kennedy, 1917 to 1963, became known for his frequent use of the televised press conference to directly communicate with Americans.
Why did John Hancock go down in history as the notable signer of the Declaration of Independence?
Most Americans know that when they're putting their John Hancock on something, it means they're signing a document. It's because of the 56 men who signed their names to the historic document. It was Hancock, 1737 to 1793, who as president of the Second Continental Congress, signed the declaration first. The events were as follows. On July 2, 1776, Thomas Jefferson, 1743–1826, presented the draft of the Declaration to the Second Continental Congress, which had convened in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, more than a year earlier, on May 10, 1775. The congressional delegates of the 13 colonies then deliberated and debated the draft, making some changes. A section was deleted that condemned England's King George III, 1738–1820, for encouraging slave trade. Other changes were cosmetic in nature. On July 4 the final draft of the Declaration was adopted by Congress. And it was then that it was signed by Hancock. The document was then printed. A few days later, on July 8, the Declaration was read to a crowd who assembled in the yard of the State House. On July 19 the Congress ordered that the Declaration of Independence be written in script on parchment. It is that copy that in early August was signed by all 56 members of the Second Continental Congress. The Declaration of Independence is housed, along with the U.S. Constitution, 1788, and the Bill of Rights, 1791, in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C., where it is on display to the public. John Hancock went on to become governor of Massachusetts, from 1780 to 1785 and from 1787 to 1793.
What were the fireside chats?
They were radio broadcasts of President Franklin D. Roosevelt's, 1882–1945, messages to the American people. FDR began making the informal addresses on March 12, 1933. During the long and dark days of the Great Depression. In his efforts to reassure the nation, FDR urged listeners to have faith in the banks and to support his New Deal measures. Sometimes beginning his talks with my friends, the radio broadcasts were enormously successful and attracted more listeners than even the most popular broadcasts during this golden age of radio. FDR continued his fireside chats into the 1940s, as Americans turned their attention to the war effort.
What is Al-Qaeda?
Al-Qaeda, Arabic, meaning the base, is a global network of terrorists who banded together during the 1990s and proclaimed to be carrying out a holy war on non-Islamic nations. The group knows no national boundaries, though certain nations, including Afghanistan, were known to be Al-Qaeda strongholds. Led by the elusive Osama bin Laden, 1957, a wealthy exiled Saudi, the group conducted terrorist training programs in several Muslim, mostly Middle Eastern, countries and was funded by loyalists around the world. One of the United States' first actions following the September 11, 2001, terrorist attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon. which were later confirmed to have been carried out by al-Qaeda operatives, was to freeze bank accounts of persons and organizations with suspected ties to the terrorist group. The roots of al-Qaeda can be traced to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, when thousands of Muslims, including bin Laden, joined the Afghan resistance. The 10-year conflict was a rallying point for Islamic extremists. Bin Laden returned home to Saudi Arabia in 1989, determined to perpetuate a holy war, jihad, by maintaining the funding, organization, and training that had made the Afghan resistance victorious against the Soviets. By the early 1990s he emerged as a leader in the Muslim world, proclaiming his goal to reinstate the Caliphate, a unified Muslim state. He also proclaimed the United States to be an enemy to Islam. He considered the nation responsible for all conflicts involving Muslims. The Saudi government rescinded his passport in 1994, and bin Laden fled his homeland. He eventually found safe harbor in Taliban-ruled Afghanistan. According to the report issued by the 9/11 Commission, bin Laden's declaration of war came in February 1998. When he and fugitive Egyptian physician Ayman al-Zawahiri arranged from their Afghanistan headquarters for an Arabic newspaper in London to publish what they termed a fatwa issued in the name of a World Islamic Front. The statement claimed that America had declared war against God and his messenger, and they called for retaliation. Under bin Laden's direction, al-Qaeda carried out several attacks on American targets, including the August 7, 1998, bombings of U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, which killed 258 and injured 5,000, and the September 11, 2001, attacks on the World Trade Center and Pentagon, which killed nearly 3,000 people. After the Global Coalition Against Terrorism, led by U.S. forces, launched its attack on Afghanistan in October 2001, bin Laden was believed to have fled for Pakistan. Capturing him and other al-Qaeda leaders and operatives was the key objective of the United States in its efforts to dismantle the terrorist network.
What was the reconstruction?
The reconstruction was the 12-year period, 1865 to 77, of rebuilding that followed the Civil War. The last battle over, the South lay in ruins, food and other supplies were scarce, people were homeless. City centers had been destroyed, schools were demolished, railways torn up, and government was non-existent. Further, the nation had new citizens to enfranchise and protect the freed slaves. There was also the question of how to readmit each southern state to the Union. In short, the nation's wounds needed to heal. But the long years of the Reconstruction brought only more divisiveness and quarrels. This time the battlefield was not Gettysburg or Chattanooga, but Washington. D.C. President Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875, a Southern Democrat and former slave owner, squared off with Congress, led by a radical Republican faction. The two branches of government fought over who should guide Reconstruction policy. Johnson favored a more tolerant and swifter approach to reuniting the nation. But his measures failed to protect the country's black citizens. Congress proceeded more cautiously, setting up military administrators in the South as an interim form of government until readmission of the states could be effected. In the end, Congress won out by overriding President Johnson's vetoes again and again. Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which took a first step toward enfranchising the black population by guaranteeing the legal rights of former slaves, the Reconstruction Acts, 1867. Outlining how each Southern state would be readmitted to the Union, the Freedmen's Bureau Bill, which extended the life of the wartime agency in order to help Southern blacks and whites get back on their feet, and adopted the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, the so-called Civil War Amendments. Since the South was based on agriculture, the economy slowly recovered, eventually becoming more industrial. Public schools were established in each state, and the state governments became more open than they had been, with more offices up for election rather than appointment. In addition, blacks were guaranteed the vote and the right to run for office. But there was resistance to all these measures, and the post-Civil War recovery was not smooth. Many historians believe that the controversy that ensued in the years that followed the Confederate surrender at Appomattox, April 1865, laid the groundwork for segregation and other injustices that brought on the civil rights movement. Many also believe that the problems are still with the country today.
Who are considered the founding fathers of the United States?
The term is used to refer to a number of American statesmen who were influential during the revolutionary period of the late 1700s. Though definitions vary, most include the authors of the Declaration of Independence and the signers of the U.S. Constitution among the nation's founding fathers. Of the 56 members of the Continental Congress who signed the Declaration of Independence, July 4, 1776, the most well-known are John Adams, 1735–1826, and Samuel Adams, 1722–1803, of Massachusetts, Benjamin Franklin, 1706–1790, of Pennsylvania, John Hancock, 1737–1793, of Massachusetts, and Thomas Jefferson, 1743–1826, of Virginia. The 39 men who signed the U.S. Constitution on September 17, 1787, include notable figures such as George Washington, 1732–1799, who would go on, of course, to become the first President of the United States. Alexander Hamilton, 1755–1804, who, as a former military aide to George Washington, went on to become the first U.S. Secretary of the Treasury, and James Madison, 1751 to 1836. Who is called the father of the Constitution for his role as negotiator and recorder of debates between the delegates. At 81 years of age, Benjamin Franklin was the oldest signer of the Constitution and was among the 6 statesmen who could claim the distinction of signing both it and the Declaration of Independence. The others were George Clymer, 1739 to 1813, Robert Morris, 1734 to 1806, George Read, 1733 to 1798, Roger Sherman, 1721 to 1793, and James Wilson, 1742 to 1798. Patriots and politicians conspicuous by their absence from the Constitutional Convention of 1787 were John Adams and Thomas Jefferson, who were performing other government duties at the time and would each go on to become U.S. President. Samuel Adams and John Jay, 1745 to 1829. Who were not appointed as state delegates but who continued in public life, holding various federal and state government offices, including governor of their states, and Patrick Henry, 1736 to 1799, of Virginia, who saw no need to go beyond the Articles of Confederation, 1777, to grant more power to the central government. Henry's view on this issue foreshadows the discontent that crested nearly 100 years later when 12 Southern states, including Virginia, seceded from the Union, causing the Civil War, 1861-65, to break out. Adams, Franklin, Hancock, Jefferson, Washington, Hamilton, Madison, Jay, and Henry. These are the names that come to mind when the words Founding Fathers are uttered. Each of them had a profound impact in the political life of the United States even beyond their starring roles as patriots and leaders during the American Revolutionary era. However, it's important to note that in many texts and to many Americans, the term Founding Fathers refers only to the men who drafted the U.S. Constitution, since it is that document that continues more than 200 years after its signing to provide the solid foundation for American democratic government.
Who wrote the U.S. Constitution?
In spirit, the U.S. Constitution was created by all of the 55 delegates to the meeting that convened on May 25, 1787. In Philadelphia's Independence Hall. Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826, called the Constitutional Convention an assembly of demigods. And with good cause, the delegates were the young nation's brightest and best. When the states had been called upon to send representatives to the meeting, 12 states answered by sending their most experienced, most talented, and smartest men, Rhode Island, which feared the interference of a strengthened national government in state affairs, sent no one to Philadelphia. Even in such stellar company, the document did have to be written. While many had a hand in this process, it was New York lawyer and future American politician and diplomat Gouverneur Morris, 1752–1816, who actually took on the task of penning the Constitution. Putting into prose the resolutions reached by the convention. Morris had the considerable help of the records that James Madison, 1751–1836, of Virginia had kept as he managed the debates among the delegates and suggested compromises. In that capacity and in that he designed the system of checks and balances among the legislative Congress, the executive, the President of the United States, and the judicial, Supreme Court. Madison had considerable influence on the document's language, quite rightfully earning him the designation Father of the Constitution. The original document, drafted by Morris, is preserved in the National Archives building in Washington, D.C. While the Constitution has been amended by Congress, the tenets set forth therein have remained with Americans for more than 2 centuries, and they have provided proof to the countries of the world that a constitution outlining the principles and purposes of its government is necessary to good government.
What were scalawags?
Scalawags was a derogatory term used by white Southerners to refer to those white Southerners who supported or were sympathetic to the goals of the Republican lawmakers during Reconstruction. 1865–77, the years of rebuilding that followed the American Civil War, 1861–65. The Republican Party was the object of much contempt in the American South during the mid to late 1860s. Congress was dominated by radical Republicans who were able to overturn presidential vetoes to achieve their goals. While President Andrew Johnson, 1808–1875, supported a lenient policy toward the Southern rebel states, Congress favored a more gradual approach to reunification. In order to prevent another resurgence in the South, Congress delayed the readmission of former Confederate states until Republican governments could be established in them. Congress was also determined to enact legislation and sponsor constitutional amendments that would extend the rights of citizenship to freed slaves. After 4 years of brutal combat during the war, many Southerners saw fit to side with the Union and with the Republican lawmakers who were determining Reconstruction policy. President Andrew Johnson had proved himself an ineffectual leader, and Congress had mustered enough votes to repeatedly override him. In fact, they impeached him in 1868. Some whites in the South, contemptuously called scalawags, joined with Northern businessmen and politicians, derisively called carpetbaggers, as well as the freed slaves to forge a new South.
When was Saddam Hussein captured?
The former Iraqi leader, known for his cruelty, was caught on December 14, 2003, 8 months after the fall of Baghdad. Hussein, 1937, was found in Ad-Dor, about 9 miles from his hometown of Tikrit. He was said to be hiding like a rat, in a hole across the Tigris River from one of his palaces. His 6 to 8 foot bunker was equipped with a basic ventilation system and was camouflaged with bricks and dirt. A disheveled Hussein had in his possession about $750,000 as well as arms, which he did not use. The former dictator was taken into custody in what U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld called a surprisingly peaceful manner. Despite that, Hussein reportedly remained defiant and unrepentant, when he was asked about the thousands of people killed and dumped into mass graves during his regime. He dismissed his victims as thieves. The news of his capture prompted jubilation in Baghdad and across the nation. Crowds of Iraqis flooded into the streets to celebrate the end of his brutal rule. But his hometown of Tikrit, considered a loyalist stronghold, remained quiet. The news of his capture was welcomed by leaders around the globe. In a short televised address from the White House, President Bush remarked that Hussein would face the justice he denied to millions. Bush also reassured the Iraqi people that they would not have to fear the rule of Saddam Hussein ever again. Hussein was held for questioning in Iraq. Upon the June 28, 2004, transfer of authority, Iraq was given legal custody of the former ruler, who became a criminal defendant instead of a prisoner of war.
What does 40 acres and a mule mean?
The term originated with Union General William T. Sherman, 1820 to 1891, toward the end of the Civil War. On January 16, 1865, in his march to the sea, the military advancement he led from Atlanta to Savannah, Sherman issued Special Field Order No. 15, which set aside a tract of land along the South Carolina, Georgia, and Florida coasts for the exclusive settlement of 40,000 freed slaves. According to the order, each black family was to be given a plot of not more than 40 acres of tillable ground, in the possession of which land the military authorities will afford them protection until such time as they can protect themselves, or until Congress shall regulate their title. All of the lands were former plantations that had been confiscated during the war. They became the jurisdiction of the Freedmen's Bureau. Though there was a provision for one or more of the captured steamers to ply between the settlements and one or more of the commercial points, to sell the products of their land and labor. There was no mention of providing a mule, or any other animal, to each freedman. The mules, tired army work animals, were distributed later to the landholders. News of 40 acres and a mule spread among the freed slaves. But soon after the war ended in April 1865, this promised to materially assist the freedman was abandoned when President Andrew Johnson, 1808 to 1875, issued pardons for the ex-Confederates and ordered their lands returned to them. The somewhat obscure term 40 acres and a mule resurfaced in the 1990s and early 2000s as the issue of reparations came to the fore in the United States.
Why was President Andrew Johnson impeached?
In late February 1868, 9 articles of impeachment were brought against Andrew Johnson over political and ideological differences between the President and Congress. Johnson self-educated, self-made, and outspoken inspired people to either love or hate him. A Southern Democrat in the U.S. Senate. He broke bonds of home and party when he swore allegiance to the Union after the outbreak of the Civil War, 1861-65. This he did because of his strong personal belief that the Southern states had violated the U.S. Constitution when they seceded from the Union. Soon this Tennessean and former Democrat shared the Union Party ticket with Republican Abraham Lincoln. 1809 to 1865, as he ran for re-election to the presidency in the fall of 1864. Inaugurated in March. Vice President Johnson became President Johnson that fateful mid-April day when Lincoln was shot as he sat watching a play at Washington, D.C.'s Ford's Theater. But Johnson's troubles had already begun. As he and Lincoln took the oath of office in March, Johnson appeared to be drunk. Some attributed this to the fact that he was recovering from typhoid fever. But one journalist labeled him a drunken clown, and a group of senators began calling for his resignation. Lincoln met with his vice president for the first and what would turn out to be the last time on April 14, just hours before Lincoln's life was claimed by assassin John Wilkes Booth, 1838 to 1865. As president, Johnson's true colors shine through. Again allegiant to his homeland, his policies toward Southern states were lenient. Ever class-conscious, he used the power of his office to demonstrate to the Southern aristocrats, whom he openly despised, just how far a poor man from North Carolina had come, as a states' rights advocate. He was ever watchful of any congressional bills that might impinge upon the freedoms of the individual states. And as a racist, he proved reticent to grant rights or protection to blacks. All of these traits combined to create sticking points between Johnson and Congress. In February 1866, Congress voted to extend the life of the Freedmen's Bureau, a War Department agency that assisted blacks and whites. But Johnson vetoed the measure, and Congress was unable to overturn his veto. Later that year, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, a bill that extended citizenship to freed slaves and guaranteed them equal protection of the laws. Believing this piece of legislation overstepped the boundaries of central government, he felt this sort of lawmaking was up to each state. He again vetoed it. But this time Congress mustered the votes it needed to overturn a presidential veto. It was the first of many veto overrides during Johnson's administration. feeling Johnson was ill-equipped to run the nation. Congress moved its meeting time so that it could keep an eye on the executive branch. Meantime, Congress was guiding Reconstruction policy. The Southern states were being run by their military administrators, reporting to General Ulysses S. Grant. 1822 to 1885, in 1867 Congress passed a law, the Tenure of Office Act, preventing the President from removing any cabinet member without Congress's permission. By this time, Congress has already begun to consider whether Johnson ought to be impeached. That fall, President Johnson pardoned many Confederate generals and officials, further raising the ire of Congress and the nation. Johnson's popularity was waning. The following February, Grant attempted to replace Edwin Stanton, 1814 to 1869, as Secretary of War. Stanton, who was favored by Congress, refused to leave his office, physically chaining himself to his desk. Congress viewed Johnson's move as a violation of the Tenure of Office Act, and proceeded to hold impeachment hearings in the House of Representatives. Within a few days, the House approved a resolution of impeachment. On March 13, the trial began in the Senate. On May 19 the Senate voted on one of the articles of impeachment. It was considered to be the one most likely to receive the two-thirds majority vote required to convict the President. The measure failed by one vote. Subsequent votes resulted in the same tally. While many believe Johnson was an inadequate and unpopular president who made numerous mistakes while in office, many others believe he was not guilty of the high crimes and misdemeanors called for in Article 2, Section 4, of the Constitution. In fact, the law that he was accused of breaking, the Tenure of Office Act, was later overturned as unconstitutional.
Why is Napoleon still controversial?
Even history has not been able to sort out the widely disparate opinions of the diminutive French ruler. And both the detractors and the champions, or some would say the apologists, continue to publish their arguments and supporting research. The most obvious point on which scholars differ centers on the fact that, first and foremost, Napoleon Bonaparte, 1769 to 1821, was a military man. Here opinion divides quite naturally. Not long after Napoleon assumed power, in the coup of 1799, he proceeded to keep France and the rest of Europe at war for more than 10 years. From the French perspective, Napoleon was a great man, a brilliant strategist who could not only muster his troops but could keep them motivated to fight one campaign after another. The targets of these campaigns: England, Russia, Austria, Germany, Spain, and Portugal among them, view Napoleon in quite a different light, as would be expected. Researchers from these countries have seen and rendered Napoleon's dark side, calling him a megalomaniac and a psychopath, and even seeing him as a forerunner of Adolf Hitler, 1889 to 1945. To further complicate the matter of how history views Napoleon, before he declared himself emperor for life in 1804, and launched his military conquests throughout the continent and beyond, 1805. Napoleon enjoyed a brief period in which many Europeans, not just the French, believed him to be a hero. After all, he assumed leadership of France after the hideous period of Robespierre's terror and the ineffectual government of the Directory. And then he proceeded to make peace with the Americans, the Russians, and the British. Many believed Napoleon was just the man to bring order to the chaos France had known since the storming of the Bastille. And he extended an olive branch to France's longtime enemies. It looked like he would restore order at home and abroad. Of course, this honeymoon did not last. By 1805, the leader many had looked to end the turmoil only became the cause of more turmoil. His compulsive war-making, as one writer put it, soon swept over the continent, ultimately uniting various countries in an effort to rid Europe of the scourge that was Napoleon and his Grand Army. Thus, students and readers are left to sort through the diverging accounts of this controversial figure. Napoleon has been called the Emperor of Kings, credited for his vision, insight, courage. And even with the development of the modern liberal democracy, he has also been described as a compulsive tyrant who had an insatiable appetite for battle, a man whose own ambitions left millions dead. But on a few descriptions both sides can agree, he was a brave soldier, an inspired military leader, and, at least for a time, a charismatic ruler.
Why did NATO respond to the 9/11 attacks?
The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, responded to the terrorist attacks on the United States, because its charter states that an attack on any member nation is considered an attack on the alliance. The language is contained in Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, signed April 4, 1949, in Washington, D.C. The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or North America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them, in exercise of the right of individual or collective self-defense, will assist the party or parties so attacked. It was the first time Article 5 had been invoked by NATO since its founding. On September 12, 2001, NATO convened a special meeting in response to the attacks on American soil and afterward issued a statement saying, in part, that the United States could rely on the support and assistance of NATO if it was found that the attack was directed from abroad. The organization's Secretary General, Lord Robertson, 1946, strongly condemned the attacks and called for the international community and the members of the alliance to unite their forces in fighting the scourge of terrorism. The invocation of Article 5 was confirmed by NATO on October 2, after U.S. Ambassador-at-Large Frank Taylor briefed the organization's chief decision-making body on the investigations into the terrorist attacks. The North Atlantic Council determined that the information provided by Taylor confirmed that the individuals who carried out the attacks belonged to the worldwide terrorist network of Al-Qaeda, headed by Osama bin Laden and protected by the Taliban regime in Afghanistan. At a press conference held October 8, Secretary-General Lord Robertson announced NATO's full support for the U.S.-led invasion of Afghanistan. The following day it was confirmed that NATO assets had been deployed to the eastern Mediterranean to establish a presence in the region. But the alliance did not take a lead role in the military effort to oust the Taliban from Afghanistan.
What does the Declaration of Independence say?
The Declaration of Independence, adopted July 4, 1776, has long been regarded as history's most eloquent statement of the rights of the people. In it, not only did the 13 American colonies declare their freedom from Britain, they also addressed the reasons for the proclamation, naming the causes which impel them to the separation, and cited the British government's violations of individual rights, saying the history of the present King George III of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, which aimed to establish an absolute tyranny over these states. The opening paragraphs go on to state the American ideal of government, an ideal that is based on the theory of natural rights. The Declaration of Independence puts forth the fundamental principles that a government exists for the benefit of the people and that all men are created equal. As the chairman of the Second Continental Congress Committee that prepared the Declaration of Independence, it was Thomas Jefferson, 1743 to 1826, who wrote and presented the first draft to the Second Continental Congress on July 2, 1776. The passage that is most frequently quoted is this: "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to effect their safety and happiness."
Why were there two continental congresses?
Both meetings were called in reaction to British Parliament's attempts to assert its control in the American colonies. When colonial delegates to the First Continental Congress met, they developed a plan but were obviously prepared for it not to work, since even before dismissal they agreed to reconvene if it were necessary to do so. In short, the first Congress developed Plan A, the second resorted to Plan B, which was one last appeal to the king, and then to Plan C, finally declaring independence from Britain. The First Continental Congress convened on September 5, 1774, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The meeting was largely a reaction to the so-called Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts, which British Parliament had passed in an effort to control Massachusetts after the rebellion of the Boston Tea Party, December 1773. Sentiment grew among the colonists that they would need to band together in order to challenge British authority. Soon 12 colonies dispatched 56 delegates to a meeting in Philadelphia. The 13th colony, Georgia, declined to send representatives but agreed to go along with whatever plan was developed. Delegates included Samuel Adams, 1722–1803, George Washington, 1732–1799. Patrick Henry, 1736–1799, John Adams, 1735–1826, and John Jay, 1745–1829. Each colony had one vote, and when the meeting ended on October 26, the outcome was this. The Congress petitioned the king, declaring that the British Parliament had no authority over the American colonies, that each colony could regulate its own affairs, and that the colonies would not trade with Britain until Parliament rescinded its trade and taxation policies. The petition stopped short of proclaiming independence from Great Britain, but the delegates agreed to meet again the following May if necessary. But King George III, 1738–1820, was determined that the British Empire be preserved at all costs. He believed that if the empire lost the American colonies, then there may be a domino effect, with other British possessions encouraged to also demand independence. He feared these losses would render Great Britain a minor state, rather than the power it was. Britain unwilling to lose control in America. In April 1775 fighting broke out between the Redcoats and Patriots at Lexington and Concord, Massachusetts. So, as agreed, the colonies again sent representatives to Philadelphia. Convening the Second Continental Congress on May 10. Delegates including George Washington, John Hancock, 1737–1793. Thomas Jefferson, 1743–1826, and Benjamin Franklin, 1706–1790, organized and prepared for the fight. Creating the Continental Army and naming Washington as its commander-in-chief. With armed conflict already underway, the Congress nevertheless moved slowly toward proclaiming independence from Britain. On July 10, 2 days after issuing a declaration to take up arms, Congress made another appeal to King George III, hoping to settle the matter without further conflict. The attempt failed, and the following summer the Second Continental Congress approved the Declaration of Independence, breaking off all ties with the mother country.